NASA's launching of Artemis 1, the largest rocket ever made, standing over 33 stories tall, marks a giant step towards its goal of returning Americans to the moon and beyond. And it has rekindled the debate whether we ever went there in the first place. And you've heard the rumors, the moon landings were faked. Conspiracy theories claim that some or all of the elements of the Apollo program and the associated moon landings were hoaxes, staged by NASA with the aid of other organizations. These groups claim that NASA and others knowingly misled the public into believing that the landings happened by manufacturing, tampering with, and destroying evidence, including photos and videotapes, radio and TV transmissions, and those moon rock samples. And these conspiracy theories have sustained public interest for more than 50 years. Opinion polls taken in various locations have shown that between 6 and 20% of Americans, 25% of Britons, and 28% of Russians still believe that these landings were faked. Even as late as 2001, a Fox television network documentary called Conspiracy Theory: Did We Land on the Moon? Claimed that NASA faked the first landing in 1969 to win the space race. So was it real or just one big hoax? Well, you're about to find out. I'm Joshua Roberts, attorney at law, and you are watching Lawyer Up. In today's episode, we will be examining the 6 crewed landings between 1969 and 1972, where some or all of them are alleged to have been faked, and that the 12 Apollo astronauts did not actually walk on the moon. In doing so, we are going to talk about the moon in general and the Apollo missions, and then we'll get into the facts. And while there are tons of conspiracy theories and arguments out there, most of them are fairly easily refuted. In this video, we are going to look at the top theories that actually have some merit, and we will evaluate the evidence and then make a decision on their legitimacy. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button for me. If you got a question or a comment, put it in the comment sections below. And if you haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? Smash that subscribe button. So any discussion about a moon landing has to start with a look at the moon. The moon is Earth's only natural satellite. It is about 1/4 of the Earth's size in diameter, comparable with the width of Australia. It lacks any significant atmosphere, and the surface gravity is about 1/6 of Earth's. Its primary influence on planet Earth is its effects on ocean tides. Interestingly, the length of a full rotation of the moon on its axis causes the same side, the near side of the moon, to always face Earth. So we never see the backside or the dark side of the moon from Earth, which is conceptually odd for something that is rotating. It is about 240,000 miles from Earth, and it takes about 3 days via spacecraft to get there. Now let's turn to relevant facts about the moon landings. The Apollo program was a United States human spaceflight initiative carried out by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, which claims to have landed the first humans on the moon from 1969 to 1972. The program was conceived in 1960 and became President John F. Kennedy's national goal, which purportedly was accomplished with the Apollo 11 mission when astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed the Apollo lunar module, nicknamed Eagle, on July 20th of 1969 and walked on the moon. This everyone remembers, but what they forget are the 5 subsequent Apollo missions that also landed astronauts on the moon. The last, Apollo 17, was in December of 1972. So in total, NASA claims to have been to the moon on 6 separate space flights, with 12 different people walking on the moon. So we aren't talking about one conspiracy event here, and that is important. So on July 20th of 1969, over 500 million people watched the first humans set foot on the moon, and it was a great success. But by 1976, allegations of a conspiracy were starting to gain a foothold. An early and influential book about the subject was We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle. This book was self-published in 1976 by Bill Casing, a former U.S. Navy officer who also worked for Rocketdyne, the company that built the F-1 engines used on the Saturn V rocket. Casing's book effectively began the discussions of the moon landings being faked. The book claimed that the chance of a successful landing on the moon was calculated to be less than 1,000%, and that it would be easier for NASA to fake the moon landings than to really go there. Then in 1980, the Flat Earth Society also accused NASA of faking the landings, arguing that they were staged by Hollywood with Walt Disney's sponsorship. Which begs the question, why would the government even have a motivation to lie about this? The first reason that conspiracy theorists give is to win the space race. President Kennedy had announced that we were going to do it, and so it was important for the government to fulfill that goal. The Soviet Union had beat us to space, so it was crucial that the United States beat them to the moon. The second reason usually cited is that it was important for NASA to fulfill its mission to make sure that it had funding going forward into the future. A failed mission could have spelled the end of the space program, but its success would guarantee its future. And the third reason that is usually cited is that it was meant to be a distraction from the negative publicity surrounding the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War. So there certainly was motivation to make sure that this mission was successful. So what evidence do skeptics point to prove or attempt to prove it was fake? And like I said before, there are hundreds of arguments, but we're going to take a look at the top ones in no particular order. And the first several deal with NASA's own photographs of the actual moon landings. Moon landing conspiracists love to point out the oddities in these photos and films taken on the moon as evidence of the hoax. So let's go through them. Number one are the crosshair photos. Now, the cameras on the moon were fitted with a clear glass plate on the front of the lens with a reticle or a crosshair etched onto it. That being so, these crosshairs would appear in every single picture because the plate was on the front of the camera lens. So it will appear in front of whatever object the camera happens to photograph. Yet there are some photos where the crosshairs appear to be blocked or behind an image, which would indicate that they were doctored. In the first photo, it appears that the crosshair is behind the piece of equipment, which is interesting. But that photo is a copy. When you look at the original pic, the reticle is present. And there are a lot of photos just like this. Another line of argument is where the crosshairs appear to be faded out. Take a look at this photo, where the crosshair is missing over the white sections of flag. Now, in regard to those types of photos, experts have stated that it was caused by a phenomenon called overexposure, where the bright white areas of emulsion bleed over the thin black crosshairs of the photo. Photography experts, including those unrelated to NASA, have stated that the oddity is consistent with what would be expected from a real moon landing and is not evidence of a tweaked image. Argument number two, there are no background stars in any of the photos taken from the moon. Conspiracists contend that NASA chose not to put stars in the photos because astronomers would have been able to use them to determine whether the photos were taken from the Earth or from the moon by comparing their positions, thus proving that they were forged. Now, the counter argument is that most of the photos were taken during the lunar daytime. And just like Earth, you don't see stars during the day. That is because the light from the sun is at least as bright as the light reflecting off the stars, so they are not detectable by the naked eye or a camera. It is a phenomenon that also occurs at sporting events held at night where stadium lights outshine starlights and they're simply not visible. Regardless, there were some photos taken with a long exposure ultraviolet camera from the moon's surface by Apollo 16 astronauts, which could pick up the faint light of stars in the background. And they showed the correct alignment of stars for the picture to have been taken from the moon. So that theory has effectively been debunked. Argument number 3 are the general distortion arguments. The angle, length, and color of a lot of shadows in several of the photos are inconsistent, which conspiracy theorists suggest means that artificial lights were used. And they point as proof to several pictures that show shadows falling into craters or hills that appear longer or shorter or distorted. We're not going to take a lot of time to go through those pictures in this particular video, but if you are interested in doing so, they take a deep dive into this topic in the Mythbusters episode, NASA Moon Landing. And to spoil the ending for you, what they determined was that the distortions in all of the pictures were caused either by reflected light and or the wide-angle lens that was used to make the pictures. The fourth argument involves prop rocks. Not pop rocks, but rocks that were used as props. The argument is that NASA used props in their photos as evidenced by the letter C being written on a moon rock. And when you look at the picture of the moon rock, it sure looks like it is a C right on it. Can you see it? Now, here is the original pic, where obviously the C is not visible and the rock is quite distant. So explanations vary as to this conspiracy theory, but most experts blame the enlargement process for distorting some portion of that image to make the rock appear to have a C on it. The fifth argument involves hot spots. There appear to be hot spots in some photos that look like a large spotlight was used instead of the sun. In particular, they have focused on this picture of Buzz Aldrin that shows an apparent hotspot in the photo. Now, the original photo is much more evenly lit, but there is still an area that is brighter to his rear, a phenomenon explained by experts simply as light being reflected off the back of his white spacesuit onto the ground. The sixth argument is the first step photo. Who filmed Neil Armstrong first stepping on the moon? It may have been a giant leap for mankind, but who was already outside of the spacecraft to take that picture? And the answer is not a who, it's a what. The Apollo video camera had been mounted on the side of the lunar module. The camera was put there specifically to record the moment of first contact with the moon and to transmit that signal back to Earth. This allowed upwards of 500 million people on Earth to watch the live feed with only a slight delay. Similar technology was also used on subsequent Apollo missions. So it is not a shock that the first steps were recorded, it was planned. Argument number 7 involves radiation. The argument is that the astronauts could not have survived the trip because of exposure to radiation from the Van Allen belts. And there are two main Van Allen belts, the inner belt and the outer belt. And the Apollo spacecraft did pass through them. But it was planned, and by design, the astronauts were shielded from the radiation by the aluminum hulls of the spacecraft. Even James Van Allen, the discoverer of the belts, the person after whom they are named and the world's foremost expert on them, has stated that the radiation levels would not be harmful to astronauts on the Apollo missions. So probably not proof of a conspiracy. Number 8 is the fluttering flag. The first U.S. flag placed on the surface of the moon by the astronauts fluttered, despite there being no wind on the moon due to a lack of atmosphere. This suggests that it was filmed on Earth and a breeze stirred the flag, and this is a fun one. So first, NASA anticipated no atmosphere when they designed the basically number 7 shaped flag rod, with a rod extending across the top of the flag as well, so that it would stay extended and not just droop straight down to the ground. So as the flag was being fastened to the rod, it vibrated. This happened when the astronauts were moving it into position. and without any air drag, the movements caused the free corner of the flag to swing like a pendulum for some time in the video. In addition, the flag was rippled because it had been folded during storage, and the ripples also look like movement in a still photo. This is one of the most popular conspiracy theories, but it was also debunked on the Mythbusters episode where they went to video of the event to show that when the astronauts let go of the flagpole, while the flag does vibrate briefly, it ultimately falls still and remains so. Number 9 is the sound stage argument. The argument is that the alleged moon landings used a sound stage and/or were filmed outside at a remote desert location using slow motion photography to make it look like the astronauts were on the moon. And this is what they did to film the movie Apollo 13. So it's possible, right? Again, not according to Mythbusters. What they did was not compare the movements of the astronauts, but the dust particles stirred up from the surface. In the film footage from the Apollo missions, dust kicked up by the astronauts' boots and the wheels of the rover vehicles rose quite highly into the air due to the lower lunar gravity. So if there had been a sound stage for hoax moon landings, the dust in the videos would not have reached the heights that it did in the Apollo film footage because of Earth's greater gravity. Smart, Mythbusters. So remember, if you ever try to perpetrate a fake lunar landing, the dust that kicks up from your moon boots gives away which planet you are on. Number 10 is the footprints argument. The argument is that the lunar module named Eagle made no mark in the moon dust when it landed. Yet much lighter astronaut footprints can be seen on the moon's surface in pictures. So the question is, how come a big, heavy spacecraft makes no indentation and little bitty tiny humans do? And it's a good question. Experts explain that while the astronauts were much lighter than the lander, that their weighted boots were much smaller than the lander's 4 large diameter foot pads. And it gets pretty mathy, but it boils down to the fact that the actual pressure per square inch of the astronaut's space boots was actually greater than the lander's weight dispersed over its large foot pads. And regardless, there was an occasion where the lander touched down and then lurched sideways and did in fact leave marks in the lunar surface. Argument number 11 involves deaths. In a televised program about the moon landing hoax allegations, Fox Entertainment Group listed the deaths of 10 astronauts and 2 civilians related to the spaceflight program as proof of an alleged cover-up. And they are dead. But the argument is pretty weak. As of now, 4 of the 12 Apollo astronauts who landed on the moon are still alive, including Buzz Aldrin. And according to experts, because of its size and complexity, the moon landing conspiracy would have to involve over 400,000 people who worked on the Apollo project for nearly 10 years, including astronauts and scientists, engineers, technicians, and skilled laborers. They would all have had to have kept this secret. Experts argue that it would have been easier just to land on the moon than to generate such a huge conspiracy to fake the landings and then try to keep it quiet. And to date, nobody from this huge group has said that the moon landings were hoaxes. Argument number 12 involves Stanley Kubrick. So filmmaker Stanley Kubrick is accused of having produced much of the footage for Apollo's 11 and 12 landings, probably because he had just directed the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is partly set on the moon and which featured advanced special effects. However, none of the sets, the filming, or the footage in any way resembles the Apollo missions. And there was a conspiracy theory that contemplated that the CIA had threatened his brother Raul to coerce Stanley to pull off the fake moon landings with NASA and then to keep them a secret. However, it was later determined that he didn't even have a brother. And finally, there's a recorded interview that purportedly was a confession by Stanley as to the hoax, but again, it was later determined to be a complete fake. So those are the 12 main conspiracy theories regarding the moon landing. There are, of course, several other technical arguments about rocket propulsion systems, communication delays, missing blueprints, missing video feeds, and those types of things have also fueled conspiracy junkies. But those arguments come with either no shred of proof or can be refuted with simple explanations. So I didn't waste time in this video talking about them, but they are out there. So what does NASA have to say about all of this? Well, they're pissed. All of the conspiracy theories and books and the TV shows ultimately provoked NASA to defend its name. And NASA has issued fact sheets responding to the claims that the Apollo moon landings had been faked. The fact sheets are particularly blunt and state that the idea of faking the moon landings was preposterous and outlandish. NASA notes that all of the operations of the Apollo program were closely followed and under the scrutiny of the news media from liftoff to splashdown, and that the media itself would have to be complicit in any conspiracy theory. NASA also refers to the rocks collected from the moon as being irrefutable evidence of the program's legitimacy, as these rocks could not have been formed on Earth. The Apollo program collected 838 pounds of moon rocks during its 6 crewed missions. Conspiracists argue that the supposed moon rocks were really collected from Antarctica and fakes. However, analysis by scientists worldwide all agree that these rocks came from the moon, and that there are no published accounts in a peer-reviewed scientific journal that disputes those claims. And while I don't understand all of the geology behind it, apparently moon rocks are easily distinguishable from Earth rocks by their unique geochemical traits. I don't know, but the US moon rocks also share the exact same traits as the Soviet moon rocks, so there's that. Finally, NASA relies on third-party evidence of these landings. Several other space programs, including the European Space Agency, programs in India, China, and Japan, have all independently provided high-definition photos taken by orbiters of the Apollo landing sites. They've taken pictures of the tracks left by lunar modules, and there are images showing that 5 of the 6 Apollo mission American flags that were erected on the moon are still standing. The exception being the Apollo 11 flag, which got blown over as their spacecraft left the moon. So at the end of the day, did the US go to the moon? Well, that's for you to decide. Tell me what you think in the comment section below. What proof makes you confident it's true, or what lack of evidence makes you believe it is not? Let me hear from you. And while you're in there, smash that like button for me. And of course, make sure you pay attention to NASA's return to the moon over the next couple of years. Well, that's the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. My name is Joshua Roberts, attorney at law, and you've been watching Lawyer Up.